Well, welcome to Focus Today. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson, and I have been looking forward to talking to our guest today for quite some time because he works with a great organization. Bryan Fischer is with us today. He's the Director of Issue Analysis for Government and Public Policy at the American Family Association. And he is also hosts his own radio show called Focal Point, heard on about 125 of the AFA radio stations network across the country. And we're going to talk with him about a variety of things. So, Bryan, thank you for letting us have some of your precious time.
In Boise, Idaho for 29 years, so I feel like I'm kind of coming back to my roots here.
Well, we can exchange fishing stories or something.
Well, wasn't much of a fisherman, despite my name. I think that got left out of my gene pool, but I do love sitting by a river and enjoying the outdoors. So I actually go out fishing with my friends that fish, and I just sit there and enjoy God's creation. But we miss the Northwest. My wife and I were talking just the other day that whenever we get to the point where we're going to slow down, we're probably going to head back out that direction.
Well, welcome. Thank you again. For those who don't know, Bryan, give us a little bit of an update of AFA and this organization. Your organization has been around for a long time. Don Wildman's worked hard, and you folks do a great job advocating for the family. But give us an update of the ministry.
Well, the American Family Association, as the name implies, is really about the American family. We want to make America the friendliest place in the world to raise a family. We want to see public policies enacted that will protect families, that will reinforce families, that will make it possible for families to be intact and healthy and strong. We believe we've drifted as a nation from the founding principles that our founding fathers had, that they used to establish the United States. We want to bring America back to those founding principles, and that includes a strong emphasis on faith, a strong emphasis on family, and a strong emphasis on freedom. So that's what we are about, restoring America to its founding principles.
And those who want to correspond with you, the website is afa.net, and they can sign up for the journal and all kinds of resources there.
Yes, afa.net. Encourage people to go there. Recommend the AFA Journal. It's a monthly publication that comes out. Folks can also sign up for our action alerts. There at the upper right-hand part of the home page, we send action alerts out about once or twice a week. It gives concerned citizens an opportunity to communicate with decision makers on issues of contemporary importance. We sent an action alert out, for instance, on the change in the Boy Scouts. We're going to send another one out probably on Monday, dealing with the changes in the Boy Scout organization. So we try to keep people abreast of what's going on in our culture and then give them an opportunity to make their voice heard.
Yeah, and I certainly take advantage of those updates and those alerts. So thank you for what you guys do.
You're welcome.
Bryan, let's get into the Boy Scouts. What a sad day when over 250,000 people signed a petition to say keep it the way it's always been, and yet 61% of their leadership said no, we're going to go in this new direction.
Well, it's really bizarre, Perry, when you think about it, because just last summer, the Executive Council of the Boy Scouts unanimously affirmed their existing policy, which was no homosexual scout leaders, no homosexuals in the scouting program. They did an extensive poll of their own people, the people that are involved at the scouting level, just the early part of this year, and 61% of them at that time said that they were in favor of supporting the existing policy. So when the vote was actually taken, and this vote was by people that are actively involved in scouting, scout leaders and regional officers and so forth, to find that 61% of them were now in favor of admitting open homosexuals into the Boy Scouts, it was a stunner to all of us. In fact, I'll tell you, Perry, we didn't even prepare a press release in prospect of a defeat. We were so certain that the Boy Scouts who actually run scouting would uphold the traditional policy that the only press release we prepared was one that affirmed the decision to uphold the policy. So we had to scramble to issue a press release, a statement, when we found out that the vote had gone the other way. So it was a shocker to a lot of people, including to those of us here at AFA. A lot of our staff here have been involved in scouting, and it was a shock to them.
Wow. So how did the infiltration take place in such a short time?
Well, it's hard to understand. It's hard to drill down to exactly what was decisive here. But I think what we can say very clearly is that the homosexual movement, the homosexual lobby, homosexual activists, I'm not speaking about all homosexuals, but those that are very active in pressing for special rights and special treatments on the basis of sexual preference, they've just been relentless. They have just hammered the Boy Scouts. They've had success with the military. They've infiltrated the military with pro-homosexual policies. And in some ways, the last sort of secular type organization left standing that upheld traditional values was the Boy Scouts of America. So they have just relentlessly put pressure on the Boy Scouts to change direction. And apparently those efforts were successful. You know, one of the problems here is the Boy Scouts have members on their executive council that are CEOs of organizations like AT&T, for instance, which have pretty radically pro-homosexual policies internally in their own organizations. And these individuals, and the next chairman of the Boy Scout Executive Council is Randall Stevenson, chairman of AT&T, CEO of AT&T. So internally, there was a lot of pressure to make this change, and in the end, they just caved.
All right, so Bryan, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, a lot of the Boy Scouts groups are sponsored by churches, and you and I can both see through that where that's going to lead. Are you encouraging churches to pull out?
Absolutely. In fact, we will send another statement out on Monday encouraging churches to terminate their sponsorships with the Boy Scouts of America. You know, 70% of scouting troops are sponsored by religious organizations, primarily churches.
Right.
And so we're encouraging them to pull out of scouting. We're encouraging parents that have children in scouting to pull their children out of scouting. You know, we can understand if you've got a boy that is close to his Eagle Scout rank, he's not got long to go, you can understand why they would want to stay in and finish out so he could attain that honor. But if parents have kids that are in the early part of the program, we are encouraging them to pull out. We believe that alternatives to the Boy Scouts are going to arise. A number of denominations have very similar scouting alternatives, and we're encouraging parents to pursue those. In fact, we've got a list of some of the alternative organizations to traditional scouting up on our website.
All right, now what actually happened was they voted to allow gay troops in, but not gay leaders in, but you know that's going to be challenged down the road.
Well, in fact, I think it's almost inevitable that that will be challenged in court on the grounds of discrimination. Hey, why is there something wrong with homosexual conduct at age 7? Why is it okay to engage in homosexual conduct at age 17, but all of a sudden it's not at age 18? So I believe we're going to see lawsuits. Courts are probably going to overturn the restriction on adult leaders, and I think probably in a matter of a year or two, you're going to have active homosexuals serving as scout leaders in the Boy Scouts. And from another vantage point, the fact that they've allowed active homosexuals into the Scouts is perhaps even worse, because typically on a campout, Boy Scouts camp 2 to a tent. So it's possible now you could have an active homosexual at age 17 sleeping in the same tent with an 11 or 12-year-old boy. We think that's just a recipe for disaster.
All right, now back to the churches who sponsor these various local clubs. If the churches don't pull out, they need to know up front, this is the camel's nose under the tent to get into the church to discriminate and create all kinds of lawsuits if they don't pull out.
Well, and the reality is this Boy Scout policy does not allow churches to opt out of this position on homosexual behavior. I mean, the Boy Scout policy is very clear that your religious convictions do not give you the right to have traditional standards in your particular Boy Scout troop. Everybody is going to be required to adopt this, including churches, even though it goes clearly against biblical teaching about human sexuality. So I don't see the churches that have a belief in the values and the standards of the Scripture, I don't believe they're going to have any moral choice but to terminate their sponsorship with the Boy Scouts.
Wow. It's just amazing. Now, have they replaced their oath, their creed, the God that they mentioned there? Is now that become a pluralistic God? It certainly is the Christian God. It has to be a pluralistic God.
Well, in fact, the atheists are now pressing to be allowed to join the Scouts, despite the fact that they don't even believe in God, and it's hard to see how the Boy Scouts could turn them down. You know, the first part of the Boy Scout honor is to do my duty to God. Well, we know very clearly from what God has revealed in the Scriptures, we know what man's duty is when it comes to sexual expression. That's to reserve sexual expression for marriage. Marriage is the union of one man and one woman. Sexual energy is to be channeled into that one sacred relationship. So we know what duty to God is. So the fact that the Boy Scouts have made this change, they've just gutted the very first part of the Boy Scout oath.
All right, so, but the actual word God there then gets redefined by their own decision, what they did by letting the homosexuals in.
Well, there's no question. You go back to the founding of the Boy Scouts in 1910, Baden-Powell, very clear that the God that he was speaking of when the Boy Scout oath was formed was the God that is revealed in the pages of the Scripture. And now the Boy Scouts are evidently redefining that God to include God in the image that you have made him, rather than man being made in the image of God. God is now being remade by the Boy Scouts in the image of man.
So when is this supposed to take place, Brian? Is that January next year?
January 1st, 2014, every scout troop in America will be obligated to admit homosexual scouts.
All right, so between now and then, churches need to seriously consider what they're doing and get out. I know people like the Assemblies of God have Royal Rangers, and I know Baptists have some certain group and other denominations. That seems to me that would put great emphasis on those types of programs to succeed.
Well, and one thing that may be the benefit in this, the silver lining in this, Perry, may be that families are going to wind up putting their young boys in organizations that explicitly uphold biblical values, or explicitly Christian in their orientation, and that may wind up being a good thing. That will be better for character formation for their young men than the alternative. So we think it may be a boost to Royal Rangers, Royal Ambassadors, and the Southern Baptist, and others like it. And a number of disaffected scout leaders like John Stemberger from Florida, he started a website called On My Honor, and they are going to meet in Louisville, Kentucky in the month of June, next month, to work on forming an alternative to the Boy Scouts, because these are all former scouts that want to come together. I mean, John Stemberger's taken off his scout uniform for the last time. I got a call on my program yesterday from a guy that's turning in his Eagle Scout Award. He's returning it to the Boy Scouts. Others took their Boy Scout uniform off for the last time on Memorial Day. They're not going to put it on again. And so I think people are hungering for an alternative to the Boy Scouts now that they've kind of completely left their moral moorings. And I think we may see a good thing arise out of that would be a great alternative for families.
Fascinating. Let me take a quick break here, Brian. We'll be right back. Bryan Fischer is with us today from the American Family Association. We have some other topics to deal with coming up in just a moment. Okay, we're back, and our special guest today is Bryan Fischer. He's the Director of Issue Analysis for Government and Public Policy at American Family Association, which is an incredible organization advocating for family values and has been around for a long time. If you're not familiar with them, let me encourage you to visit their website, afa.net, and sign up for their journal, and also maybe click on where you can get their special alerts that come out a couple of times a week. I resource their website a lot, and I tell you, it's great information. Brian, let's kind of switch topics here, because I know that you kind of track all the things going on. Can you just maybe give us a bird's eye opinion of what you think is going on in Washington with all the messes and the scandals?
Well, I think, there are a number of concerns for people that are social and faith conservatives going on with these scandals. You've got obviously problems with Benghazi, our whole orientation toward the Islamic faith. We've got an administration that wants to perpetuate the myth and the lie that Islam is a religion of peace. We look around the world and we see very clearly, it is not. So that's a concern sort of on the global religious front. You've got the scandals with the probing of reporters' records.
Right. That
threatens the First Amendment and freedom of the press and freedom of speech. That ought to be a concern to all of us that care about the Constitution. But I think the number one issue that ought to be a concern to those of us, Perry, and the people that make up the majority of our listening audience, is this IRS harassment, the use of the IRS to harass conservative groups, not just Tea Party groups, but groups that wanted to educate people on the Constitution. We discovered that the Billy Graham Association was audited by the IRS. Mm-hmm. We discovered that James Dobson was obstructed in his quest to get a tax-exempt status for a 501c4 organization. It probably affected the results of the 2012 presidential election. This was very clearly an instance of voter suppression, where Tea Party groups could not get tax-exempt status. It limited their ability to raise funds. Mm-hmm. It limited their ability to be involved in turning out voters and educating voters, and may have had a material effect on the outcome of that election. So when you begin to tamper with the electoral process, that goes right to the very root of what a Republican form of government is all about. And particularly when you see an administration that I believe has been hostile to Christian faith, conservative Christian faith. We've seen the military tagging evangelicals as a domestic threat. Right. AFA has been classified by the military as a domestic hate group. This ought to be a grave concern to us. And so I think people that are motivated by their Christian faith and desire to have this nation preserve religious liberty ought to be deeply concerned and ought to be pressing to see that the truth is surfaced and that action is taken to correct these abuses.
There's an old saying, you don't break God's laws break you. And apparently God is starting to move now. He's allowing all of this nonsense to surface and be investigated. It appears to me that maybe God's involved in this exposure.
Well, one of the things that's happened, I think, Perry, with some of the things we've seen coming out of this current administration is the people of faith in America, Christians, have been motivated to pray that God would intervene. I mean, almost a cry of desperation for God to intervene. And one of the things that Jesus promised us, he said, look, if you pray according to my will, I will hear your prayers and I will answer. And one of the things that Jesus said is things that are whispered in the dark will be shouted from the rooftops. Things that are concealed will be brought out into the open. And I think perhaps we are beginning to see that. All of these things, whether it's Benghazi, whether it's the press, whether it's IRS, all of these things were concealed, they were hidden. Now all of them suddenly have come to light. Truth is the best disinfectant, light is the best disinfectant, and so perhaps God is beginning to answer the prayers of the American people that this drift from our foundation, our moorings, may be we may be prepared for a correction here, which would be very good.
Do you think the faith community in the United States, Bryan, understands the threat of Islam?
No, they do not. I think, the American people, and Christians in particular, we are nice people. Mm-hmm. We want to be kind to everybody. We want to be accommodating to everybody. But I think what we need to remember is that God has not called us to be nice. He's called us to be good. Nice people never confront evil, never identify evil. Good people do. And I think it's important that we tell the truth about Islam. And we're not talking about Muslims here. I am pro-Muslim because I want Muslims to come out of the darkness and deception of Islam. I am against Islam because of its ideology. It's a totalitarian ideology. It is virulently anti-Christian. We are regarded as infidels and idolaters and pigs and dogs, according to the Quran, according to the founder of Islam. And it's time for the church in particular to be aware of the threat that Islam represents to religious liberty, not just to liberty, but in particular religious liberty. Everywhere you see Islam in the ascendancy, you see the suppression of Christian faith.
That's a great point. Not that we should shy away from fighting for the particular issues as they come into the public debate for law or consideration of law at the various states level or even at the national level. But what seems to be slipping through our fingers right here is religious liberty. If we don't all bind together, the government's going to make laws that outlaws us all.
Well, and I think we do need to understand, go back to the homosexual agenda just for a moment. I think we need to understand, Perry, and Christians need to understand that every single advance of the homosexual agenda comes at the expense of religious liberty. Every piece of turf that the homosexual agenda takes in our culture, they have to take from the turf that once belonged to religious liberty. You've seen just north of you in the Seattle area where a florist who refused to do an arrangement for a homosexual wedding got sued by the Attorney General of the state of Washington. That's a direct infringement on her religious liberty. And so we need to be aware that we're involved in a culture war here, and we cannot give an inch in this culture war.
Well said. Let me slip over a few moments we have left. We watched in horror the Gosnell trial, and I understand now there's even another investigation going on in Texas in a similar type setting with a clinic there.
Yes.
Do you think that this kind of exposure, or what abortion is all about, will surface enough that we will understand what we're doing with the unborn?
Well, I certainly hope so. And one of the things that's interesting to me, Perry, to watch even people in the secular community, how rattled they have been by what came out in the Gosnell trial. One of my favorite writers is James Taranto with the Wall Street Journal. He's committed to the pro-choice position, but he wrote a 9-page column on the Gosnell trial, and it was clear to me that what came out in that trial just shook him to his foundations. And he wound up saying, well, I'm still pro-choice, but I realize that my position is illogical. I understand that science and biology tell us that life begins at conception. Any point at which you would terminate that life between the moment of conception and natural death is purely arbitrary and basically illogical. That's a human life from the moment of conception. So he even admitted in his own piece that my position is irrational. It is illogical. It's purely an emotional position. If I was driven by reason and logic here, I would want to protect human life from the moment of conception. So I think it's moved the needle And I think what will happen in this with this Houston abortionist, very similar situation. I think maybe this is good news. Maybe we're beginning to make some progress. I believe, in fact, we are winning the battle for the hearts and minds of the American people on the abortion issue. Millennials, the younger generation, they're actually more pro-life than their parents, and that's a good sign.
Yeah, I've been studying that as well. That you're absolutely right on that. Well, I would just find it shocking that even Gosnell attorney got up and talked about the horrifying procedure that abortion is. I thought, well, that's strange. The defense attorney would even admit that it was a horrifying procedure.
You know, well, perhaps the most striking thing in that whole trial was that his attorney offered absolutely no defense. They made absolutely no defense, and it's simply because what he was doing was indefensible. There was no defense for his conduct.
Yeah. Well, I would hope that gets more exposure so that we can certainly continue to fight for the life and the liberty of the unborn. Anything else out there, Brian, that you're tracking there at AFA that concerns you?
Well, I think we're watching what's going on in Washington, D.C. We're watching very carefully what's going on with the Boy Scouts of America. You know, it's interesting, the Pew Research Center came out with results yesterday that 40% of American homes are headed by women who are the primary breadwinners.
Right.
40%. Right. And, you know, even liberal pundits are alarmed at this because they realize now that's putting an incredible amount of pressure on women, pressure perhaps, in my judgment anyway, that they were never designed by the Creator to bear. The responsibility of being a provider really rests with husbands and fathers in God's economy. Women are to be nurturers and create a home for their children and for their husbands. And even liberals are alarmed at this. They realize now that young boys are growing up with no role model of a man who is a father, who is a leader, who is engaged in his family, and who is a provider, which means you could have some generational repercussions for generations to come, which are not good for America. And it's been striking to me to see that even liberal pundits like Juan Williams are pretty alarmed at this.
Well, things are turning and God is moving. I don't know why we're shocked by all this exposure, but I think you said it well. The things that are done in secret and in dark would be exposed to the light.
Yes.
Well, Brian, you're an inspiration and delight. Again, people that want to correspond with the AFA, go to afa.net. And your radio show, what are you, 1 to 3 Central Time?
1 to 3 p.m. Central Time. And if folks would like to tune in and don't have a radio station in their community, we audio and video stream at AFR for American Family Radio, AFR.net, 1 to 3 p.m. Central. I guess that would be, what, 11 to 1 your time?
Yeah, right. Well, we welcome you back to the Pacific Northwest when God allows it.
All right, Perry, we're looking forward to it. Trust me.
Okay, nice to have you, Brian.
All right, thank you very much.
We'll be right back.